watching Medfield TV, community shows.
I'm David Temple. I'm the president of the Historical Society. Everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. Yes. I'm really kind of psyched about tonight's presentation about the man who founded Medfield in 1649. He was also a selectman and Medfield's first school teacher. Last spring, I Googled Ralph Wheelock Medfield to see what I would find. I got about 13,000 hits. On the other hand, if you Google Lowell Mason, you get 200,000 hits. So just keep Ralph in perspective that way. The first hit was the Wheelock School, and then there was a Wikipedia article. But then I had a wow moment. There was a website called wheelockgenealogy.com. A software engineer in Northborough named Rick Sullivan, who used to live in Norfolk, whose mother was a Wheelock, spent 20 years tracing the family history. He's produced a 1,000-page document entitled The Descendants of Reverend Ralph Wheelock. Are you going to do all 1,000?
No, not tonight.
Okay.
We'll try to get under.
Yeah, okay. Ralph and Rebecca Wheelock had 9 children who lived to adulthood.
Yes.
I read the whole paper. I think I was from school.
Okay.
Wheelock.
Yeah. Anyway, Ralph and his wife Rebecca had 9 children who lived to adulthood, and they were indeed fruitful, and boy did they multiply. At the Society, we constantly get inquiries from Wheelocks across the country. So I saw this and I called up Rick, and he agreed to give tonight's talk about this remarkable and accomplished family. Before I turn things over to Rick, though, I have a few other announcements. First, the Society's open hours have changed as an experiment. Some of you were good enough to complete the survey that we did last spring, and a number of people suggested being open Saturday afternoon. So we're trying it as an experiment in September and October, and we'll see at the end of October what the traffic is like, and we'll either continue it or go back. People in the survey said, why isn't the Society open for more than just the 2 hours on Saturday? The answer is that we need more volunteers to staff it. And hint, hint, hint. And hint takers, please see me before you leave. I have a sign-in sheet here that I'd like to have people sign if they're already getting the portal and we have your email address, no need. But if you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you would sign this. And feel free to check the volunteer box if you would like. Second thing is that we have our annual Peak House Pantry sale coming up. It's, as usual, the Saturday before Thanksgiving. It's the 19th this year. We are looking for stuff to sell at the White Elephant table, and it's our biggest fundraiser of the year. So I'd ask everybody to look around the house, especially in the basement and the attic, for stuff that you have that you don't use, don't need, but it's too good to throw away, but that somebody might buy at a White Elephant sale. And please get in touch with me. Medfield Historical Society at Gmail, or just drop it off the Friday afternoon before the sale. That'll be the 18th of November. It would take anything anybody has that somebody might buy. Since it's before Thanksgiving, seasonal stuff for Christmas or Thanksgiving would be good. Books, CDs, DVDs, arts, lamps, toys, nothing broken, and I don't want anything that might be a vermin haven, like a stuffed animal. The third thing is I'd ask people to send a get well card to Barbara Layton. Does everybody know Barbara Layton? Yeah. Barbara has had hip surgery and is doing well. I heard this from Caroline Stanley via Eve Potts. She's in her 90s and she can't handle visitors yet, but she'd really appreciate a get well card. She's probably the only person in Medfield that knows more Medfield history than Richard Destorger. And she's done a lot of good work for the Society, the Historical Commission, the Dwight Derby House, the Gristmill Restoration Committee, and other organizations as well. It's LEIGHTON 4 Robert Spruill Road. Finally, I'm happy to announce that Richard Destorger will be doing the November 7th program a month from tonight. September 14th marked the 125th anniversary of the founding of the Historical Society. Richard is going to be talking and hosting the birthday party. I think he's going to get a Peak House-shaped cake, but he's going to be up on November 7th. Are there any questions or comments or anything? Okay. I have a question for the audience. I contacted the Wheelocks that I could find within a 25-mile or so radius, and I see one Wheelock here. Is there any other? Yeah. I tried calling people. More than half of the telephone numbers that were listed, and there were 10 pages of them online under the yellow pages. So there were 100 of them, 100 Wheelocks listed, and of the ones I called, more than half had, I'm sorry, the number is no longer in service. But there was one other person that I thought might come, but not here yet. Okay. Anyway, now it is my great pleasure to introduce Rick Sullivan from Northborough, who's going to be talking about Dr. Ralph Wheelock and his descendants, a short history.
Well, thank you very much, David. I appreciate that introduction. So, as David said, my name is Rick Sullivan, and I'm really happy to be here talking to you tonight. My mother was Betty Jean Wheelock, who was a direct descendant of Reverend Ralph Wheelock, whom you all know as the founder of Medfield. And from my mother, I got a fascination for Wheelock family history and genealogy. I've been working on it now for at least 20 years, and I really like talking about it. And in the mid-90s, I found a way to combine my love of genealogy with my love of computers by creating wheelockgenealogy.com. And at the time, this was a really new and exciting way to publish a genealogy. People did not have to go to the library to read it. They could just, anybody could read it. People could submit corrections, and they could submit extensions to the family tree. And in that way, the family tree grew over time. It became more complete, more accurate. But more importantly to me, it allowed me to connect with Wheelock genealogists and enthusiasts from all over the country and even all over the world. And I got to hear Wheelock family stories and publish them on the website to share with everybody else. Now, I mentioned that I like talking about Wheelock genealogy, and by now my family's probably a little tired of hearing about it, so it was with pleasure that I accepted David's invitation to talk to you, a new audience. Now, the challenge in talking about family history, especially to people who don't share it, is to make it interesting. And from my perspective, any random fact about Wheelock genealogy will get my rapt attention. I love it. But, you know, as I've discovered over the years, not everybody shares my enthusiasm for the subject. And so my modest goal tonight is to not be boring, first and foremost, and to tell you something interesting about Reverend Ralph Wheelock's progeny. Working in my favor, you know, is the fact that the story of his descendants is shared by many who came to Massachusetts in the 1600s. The details will differ, but the broad outlines should look familiar to anyone who can trace their ancestry back to that time period. So in a way, this story belongs to all of us. So let me go over what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give a brief overview of the life of Ralph Wheelock up to, but not including his time in Medfield, because I think most of you are probably familiar with that story, and if you're not, the story is readily available in the local history books. I'm going to talk about the early patterns of relocation of the family, just the first few generations, because I think those series of movements farther west, pushing the frontier, is probably typical for many colonial New England families. I'm going to talk about Reverend Eleazar Wheelock, because he was probably the most famous Wheelock in colonial history. I'll talk just a little bit about Wheelocks in the Revolutionary War, a little more about Wheelocks in the Civil War, and then since we live so close to the Blackstone River Valley, which is considered the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution, I thought I would talk about a couple local Wheelocks who played an important role in developing technologies that powered the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, I'll close with a mention of some famous descendants of Ralph and Rebecca, some of whom you probably would have heard of. Okay, so let me start with Ralph. David, could you advance the slides? Okay, Reverend Ralph Wheelock was born in Shropshire, England in 1600. He was a Puritan minister. He obtained his graduate degree from Clare Hall in Cambridge. And Cambridge at the time was the center of the dissenting movement called Puritanism. And you may remember from your history that Puritans had big ideas about changes they wanted to make to the Church of England. They wanted to purify the church, and so that's why they called them Puritans. And as you can imagine, this threatened the established institutions, most notably the monarchy and the clergy. And as a consequence, many Puritans, and especially Puritan ministers, were under a lot of pressure at the time. Many were being dismissed from their positions. Some were being excommunicated, which was, I guess, still a thing at that time. Some were being imprisoned, and in extreme cases, some were being executed. So we don't know for sure why Ralph decided to come to Massachusetts. But in all likelihood, it had to do with this, with the oppression that Puritans were getting at the time in England. He may have come under duress. It's possible. He had 3 young children at the time. His wife, Rebecca, was in the late stages of pregnancy with their 4th. And so it's really hard to imagine that she was excited about taking a minimum 6-week voyage of uncertain outcome over rough seas. But for whatever the reason, Ralph and his family came over in 1637. And by July of that year, Ralph had signed the Dedham Covenant, which was the founding document of the town of Dedham. My guess is that Ralph had wanted to be the pastor in Dedham. He was a minister back in England, and there was clearly an open position in Dedham, a brand new town, and so I think he probably wanted to take that position, but he didn't, unfortunately for him anyway. It went to Reverend Allen, but he held leadership positions in Dedham for the next 14 years. The town held him in high esteem, and examples of that include that he was one of 8 men chosen for, quote, ye ordering of town affairs, which I think is probably positioned similar to modern-day selectmen. He was chosen to assist the surveyor in laying out lots in Dedham and in establishing the town boundaries, which was a very important position at the time. And in 1644, the town voted to build a public school in Dedham, and Ralph was appointed its headmaster. Next slide. So this is the first taxpayer-funded public school in America, and Ralph is credited with being the first public school teacher in America. And this picture is a reconstruction from early town records of Dedham, of what the school must have looked like. And as we'll see, Ralph Wheelock's tradition or teaching career established a tradition that was passed down in the family. And of course, another demonstration of the trust that the town of Dedham held for Ralph is demonstrated by the fact that he was chosen by the town to lead the effort to establish a new town further up the Charles River, which was eventually called Medfield. Now, as David said, Ralph and his wife Rebecca had 9 children, and most of them lived to the ripe old age, or to a late age, which gave Ralph and Rebecca almost 50 grandchildren and at least 155 great-grandchildren. Nobody knows exactly how many descendants of Ralph and Rebecca survive today, but there seem to be quite a few of us. And I'm going to ask, it's probably a good time to ask how many people can trace their ancestry back to Ralph and Rebecca? Okay, there's a few. Not quite enough to make a family reunion, but it's close. So I count over 5,000 Wheelocks in the white pages, and not all of them, it turns out, are descendants of Ralph and Rebecca. Of course, there are going to be many more descendants of Ralph and Rebecca than just those 5,000 with the surname Wheelock in the white pages. But anyway, not everybody with the Wheelock surname is descended from Ralph and Rebecca. Some are descended from James Wheelock of Virginia. James is not a descendant of Ralph, although he's probably related to Ralph. My guess is that his grandfather or great-grandfather came over from England, maybe in the late 1600s or early 1700s. And many with the Wheelock surname in the South are descended from this James Wheelock. And as it turns out, there are many Native Americans with the Wheelock surname, and we'll talk a little later about how that came to be. And a few with the Wheelock surname in this country are descended from a Charles Wheelock, who came from Ireland to America in 1810. And then quite a few with the Wheelock surname in South America and Central America are descended from Thomas Wheelock, who went from England to Peru in the mid-1800s to get involved in the mining business there. So no doubt, there are no doubt some Wheelocks in this country who don't descend from any of those people there. But at least in my experience, the vast majority of people with the surname Wheelock descend from Reverend Ralph Wheelock and his wife, Rebecca. So I'm going to talk about the early patterns of relocation in the first few generations of the Wheelock family. Like all colonial families in New England, the descendants of Ralph were constantly pushing the boundaries of the frontier, always looking for new lands with which to make a living, generally moving westward. And Ralph himself did this twice, coming first from England to Dedham in 1637, and then later from Dedham to Medfield in 1651. And as it turns out, for the next 200 years, his progeny did pretty much the same kind of thing, moving westward. His daughter, Record, was an early settler of Marlborough. She married into the Ward family there, and at the time, Marlborough was a frontier town. It's hard to imagine Marlborough as a frontier town now, at least for me, but at one time it was right on the edge. And Ralph and Rebecca's son, Benjamin, went to Mendon and became an early founder of Mendon. His name appears on the Founders Monument there. And Benjamin's descendants spread to Burrillville, Gloucester, Smithfield, Rhode Island, and Uxbridge, Massachusetts, where many of his descendants still live. One of them is here with us today. And then later to Charlton, New York, and other parts of New England. Ralph's grandchildren were early settlers of Shrewsbury. Samuel Wheelock, his grandson, signed one of the first deeds in Shrewsbury and was a founder of the first church there. And Samuel's son Gershom has the distinction of being the first person to build a house in Shrewsbury. And Elizabeth Ward writes a delightful description of Gershom's construction of this house in her book, Old Times in Shrewsbury, as follows, quote, "He labored alone that winter, keeping up his spirits through the cold, dreary days by his merry whistling, sleeping in the loft and pulling the ladder up after him at night, always whistling his morning song before putting it down again. His courage never failed until the spring birds sang to him while he whistled, and the house was done. Then he married Abigail Flagg of Marlborough, and housekeeping began in Shrewsbury. So I love that image of Gershom being so excited about getting married in the spring that he was able to keep his spirits high during a cold, dark winter, building a house for his new bride. At any rate, descendants of Samuel and Gershom spread into Grafton, Millbury, Sutton, and other nearby towns, and later to Cavendish, Vermont, Eden, Vermont, and New Ipswich, New Hampshire. Now, descendants of Ralph also spread into Nova Scotia in a story that I think is pretty interesting, and is probably typical for many colonial New England families. After the British won the French and Indian War, they decided it was necessary to forcibly deport the French settlers, also called Acadians, who lived in Nova Scotia. The Acadians had not been willing to give unconditional loyalty to the British. They had engaged in military operations against the British in support of the French, and as a consequence, the British forcibly removed 11,500 Acadians from Nova Scotia, leaving entire farms and fisheries vacant. In order to populate these empty farms with loyal British subjects, the British extended land grants to New Englanders. So basically, anybody who would go occupy move to the farm and make it productive could basically have it. So it was a good deal, and quite a few New Englanders took advantage of the opportunity, including 4 members of the Wheelock family, 3 of whom were brothers, and 1 of whom was more distantly related, and probably didn't know about the other 3. They all moved to Nova Scotia in the 1760s and established a long line of Wheelock family members, many of whom still live there today, and some of whom have moved back into the United States, the East Coast and the Midwest mostly. Now this picture, or this poster, is hanging at the Acadian Deportation Museum in Nova Scotia. And it shows where the Acadians were deported to. Many of them were deported to the east coast of the colonies, quite a few deported directly to France, some to the Caribbean, and then many to Louisiana and the New Orleans area, where their influence is still strongly felt today. By the way, if anybody has any questions, please just chime in. I'll be happy to answer, and then I'll open it up too at the end for questions. So after the Revolutionary War, most of western New York was put up for sale by the Holland Land Company at about between $2.50 and $10 per acre. Many from New England took advantage of this opportunity, including the members of the Wheelock family from Mendon and from Charlton, where my Wheelock ancestors came from. They were early settlers of the towns of Batavia, Concord, Holland, and Hamburg in western New York. And then over subsequent generations, members of the Wheelock family just continued to move westward, moving to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Utah, Texas, and California. And the Wheelock family played an interesting role in the early settlement of Texas. There's an amazing book written by Mary Foster Hutchinson on the life of Colonel Louis Eleazar Ripley Wheelock. I think I got all those words right. And I put that book in the bibliography, which is up here, if anybody wants to pick one up before they leave. Colonel Wheelock was a captain in the Texas Rangers, and he founded the town of Wheelock, Texas. Have people heard of Dr. Eleazar Wheelock? Most people have, some people haven't. All right, so he was by far and away the most famous colonial American Wheelock. If you do searches for Wheelock, his name will come up all over the place. He was the great-grandson of Reverend Ralph Wheelock, and he came of age during the First Great Awakening, which was a religious movement that swept the colonies in the early and mid-1700s. The Great Awakening brought about a religious zeal that was very different from the stiff and uptight Puritanism that dominated the earlier century. It was characterized by great emotion and fervor during prayer. It emphasized religious principles over the attainment of wealth and worldly goods. And it featured traveling evangelists who gave impassioned sermons to large crowds and conducted dramatic religious conversions. This is a picture of George Whitefield preaching to the crowds. He was a popular preacher during this time period, and this is probably what a typical sermon looked like. Now, Wheelock was a graduate of Yale. He graduated with a divinity degree, and he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Great Awakening. And like George Whitefield, he was an itinerant preacher, even though he had a permanent congregation in Lebanon, Connecticut. In 1741, he traveled throughout Connecticut, giving sermons to crowds in support of the Great Awakening. And in that year, he was said to have written 465 sermons, which, if you think about it, is a pretty busy schedule. And it showed just what commitment he had to the project. And he was considered by his contemporaries to be, quote, chief intelligencer of revival news, unquote, which I take to mean if you really wanted to know something about what was going on with the Great Awakening, you would talk to Reverend Eleazar Wheelock, because he was kind of at the center of things. Now, not surprisingly, the Great Awakening threatened established religious institutions, and it led to divisions, religious divisions throughout the colonies. And in 1743, the Connecticut Assembly clamped down on revivalist movements, and they put in place rules, regulations, and laws that were designed to inhibit the growth of revivalism. And one of those rules was that if you taught or if you preached outside of your own congregation, you were not allowed to collect a salary. So that hit Wheelock straight in the head. It left him without a source of income. And in order to rectify that, he started to take students into his home. Next slide. And one of those students was Samson Occam, who was a Mohican. He had been converted to Christianity in his childhood and also had learned English. Wheelock had amazing success preparing Samson Occam for the ministry. Partly as a result of Wheelock's instruction, Samson Occam went on to become a famous and very popular Presbyterian minister. He taught to both Native American as well as colonial American crowds. So with that success in his pocket, Wheelock was inspired to set up a school for Native Americans. He figured he could replicate the success he had with Samson Occam with other Native American students. And the idea with this school for Native Americans, he was going to take in both boys and girls. And the boys were to be given religious instruction, which they would then, the idea was that they would take it back to their native cultures, essentially as missionaries. And the girls had a role too. They were to be taught housewifery. So Wheelock spent a lot of time raising money for this new school. And toward that end, he sent Samson Occam and a Presbyterian minister by the name of Nathaniel Whitaker to England to raise money. and they had great success. They raised 12,000 pounds, which was held in trust by an English board of trustees, which was headed by the Earl of Dartmouth. Now, unfortunately, Wheelock didn't have anywhere near as much success raising or recruiting Native American students. And to me, it hardly seems surprising that Native Americans would not want to spend years of their life studying white man's religion at the hands of people who really hadn't treated them very well over the last 100 and 150 years. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea to Wheelock, to his supporters, and to his investors. And to be fair, it was just part of the culture or the cultural fabric of the time. At any rate, it was a setback for Wheelock not to be able to recruit students. He couldn't really open his school without students. So he had to come up with a plan B. And his plan B was to extend the school to include whites as well as Native Americans. And with that extended mission, he was able to obtain a charter from the school from King George III. He cited the school in New Hampshire. He called it Dartmouth. And he became its first president. And they graduated the first class of 4 students in 1771. 4 men, one of whom was his son, John Wheelock, who went on to become the second president of Dartmouth. Now, despite its start as a school for Native Americans, it really fell short of its goal of educating Native Americans. For the next 200 years, only 19 Native American students had been graduated from Dartmouth, so not a real success story there. But in 1970, the then 13th president of Dartmouth, George Kemeny, decided to recommit the school to its founding purpose. He put in place programs to aggressively recruit Native Americans. And by this year, 2016, 700 Native Americans have graduated from Dartmouth from over 200 different tribes. So this is more than all the other Ivy League schools combined. And I mentioned earlier that many Native Americans bear the Wheelock surname, especially amongst the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. During colonial times, it was common for Native Americans to adopt English surnames. And it's not really surprising that given that Wheelock worked so closely with Native Americans over the years, especially the Oneida tribe, it's not really surprising that some of them would have taken on the Wheelock surname early in their lives. We don't know exactly who it was or when, but probably in the late 1700s or early 1800s. And many of the Oneida Nation now have the last name Wheelock, and some of them are quite famous in their own right, being football players and band leaders and composers. And if you do a Google search on Carlisle Indian School, you'll find out more about those. So Eleazar was not the only Wheelock interested in education. His distant cousin, several times removed, Lucy Wheelock, founded Wheelock College in Boston. I'm not going to say too much about that, just based on time limitations, but it is an interesting story, and if you want to learn more, you can go to the website. I do show her descent from Ralph, because it's along 2 different lines, and I just thought that was interesting because I think many of us, if we did the research, could probably find ancestors from which we descend across multiple lines. So I'm not going to say much about Wheelocks in the Revolutionary War, except to note that they tended to, at least the highest ranking Wheelocks, tended to cluster in families. And I don't know if that's nature or nurture or just family influence, or perhaps all 3. But of the 3 high-ranking Wheelocks in Massachusetts, 2 of them were brothers, Colonel Ephraim Wheelock of Medfield, who commanded the 4th Suffolk County Regiment, and his brother, Lieutenant Colonel Moses Wheelock of Westboro, who was a commander in the 6th Worcester County Regiment. And then there were 2 fairly high-ranking officers from New Hampshire. One was Lieutenant Colonel John Wheelock, who was the son of Eleazar Wheelock, and then his brother, Lieutenant Eleazar Wheelock. And as it turns out, Colonel Ephraim and Colonel Moses Wheelock of Massachusetts were first cousins of Eleazar Wheelock, who founded Dartmouth. And Colonel John Wheelock and Eleazar Wheelock of Vermont corresponded with founding fathers, and the actual copies of that correspondence can be found in the archives at the Library of Congress. Okay, so moving on to the Civil War. I count about 215 distinct Wheelock men who fought in the Civil War. The vast majority of them fought for the Union and were descendants of Reverend Ralph. A few, well, more than a few fought for the Confederate cause, but most of those were descendants of the James Wheelock of Virginia that I mentioned earlier. But there were a few descendants of Ralph who fought for the Confederate cause. And 3 of these were sons of Josephus Wheelock, whose life story is probably typical of Southern families with Northern origins at that time. I'm not exactly sure how you say Josephus, whether it's Josephus or Josephus or something else, but I like Josephus, so I'm going to go with that. Josephus was born in Massachusetts. He fought in the War of 1812 in Vermont, and then moved to Alabama in a mass migration of settlers that's been called Alabama fever. And Alabama fever was triggered by the forced removal of Creek natives from their southern homelands to reservations farther west. There's that forced removal thing. It shows up over and over again. This was a forerunner of the Trail of Tears, which happened about a decade later. The Creek clearances opened up vast tracts of land in the South for settlement, and Josephus Wheelock was one person who took advantage of that. Moving south probably around 1820 or 1822, he married a Southern woman. He had many children by his wife in Alabama and Arkansas, and in the 1840 census, he's listed as a farmer with 11 slaves. Now, his wife died at a relatively early age, well before the Civil War, and Josephus then married a Northern woman from Vermont. In fact, he went up to Vermont to marry this woman and then went back home to Alabama. Now, he must have known this woman from his earlier life in Vermont, I guess. You know, I'll never know for sure. But Josephus had 3 sons who fought for the Confederacy, but he claimed himself to be a Southern loyalist. And how do we know that? Because after the war, Congress created the Southern Claims Commission, whose purpose was to reimburse Southern loyalists, those loyal to the Union and their cause, for lost goods and property damage suffered at the hands of the Union Army. And Josephus made such a claim for over $12,000, but was denied. And the records don't say exactly why he was denied. It's possible he was denied because he died during the process. But his son took over the claims process for him after he died, not one of his Confederate soldier sons, but another son, who probably was a loyalist. At any rate, he was denied, and after his death, his wife moved back north, back to her hometown in Vermont. And his Confederate sons survived the war and lived out the remainder of their lives in the South. Now, my wife thinks that he was denied because he wasn't really a loyalist. He just wanted to get the money for his lost goods. Why not? Right. And it's possible, could be true. But the way I figure it is he did have deep roots in the North. His wife obviously had deep roots in the North. And if he wasn't really a loyalist, at least he had to pretend to be one to keep the peace. So I did find 5 Wheelocks who fought in the colored regiments. One of them, by the way, was Jerry Wheelock. Now, I don't know if that was your ancestor or a relative or somebody else. I haven't been able to... Yes, I haven't been able to place that Jerry Wheelock. But one of the 5 Wheelocks was Edwin Miller Wheelock, who was a white person. He was an abolitionist, a fairly well-known abolitionist. And then the other 4, including Jerry Wheelock, I haven't been able to trace. I assume that they were slaves who had taken on the Wheelock surname, but I don't know. Okay, the highest ranking Wheelock to fight in the Civil War was Brigadier General Charles Wheelock, who commanded the New York 97th Regiment. Now, the most interesting story about Charles involves the battle at Gettysburg. He led the 97th in that battle, and he suffered devastating losses. It was a nasty campaign, a nasty engagement. Over half of the regiment was either captured or killed, and Wheelock himself was captured after being cornered in a farmhouse owned by a Miss Carrie Sheads. And as the story goes, he was cornered there by rebels, but refused to give up his sword, asking instead to be shot. So next slide, please. Now, as it turns out, the farmhouse is still standing in Gettysburg, and it's a National Historical Landmark, and it's of interest partly because it has a shell from the battle still protruding from its south wall. You can maybe sort of see it in this picture, but if you go to the next picture, David, it should be more readily visible. There it is, sticking out of the wall. Now, why the Sheads family didn't remove the shell after the war, I don't know. Maybe it was too expensive, or maybe they were afraid that it would explode if they touched it. I don't know. But it's good that they didn't, because it makes an interesting historical curiosity now. And as it turns out, there are many farmhouses or houses, buildings in Gettysburg that have munitions stuck into their wall. And there's a walking tour you can do to visit all of them. But at any rate, Wheelock refused to give up his sword. And while his capturing Confederate officer was temporarily distracted, he handed the sword to Carrie Sheads to hide in the folds of her dress. When the captors came back, he convinced them that he had given the sword to another rebel officer, and they believed him. And they led him and the other captives out of the farmhouse, presumably to a prison somewhere. But Wheelock managed to escape, and for 6 days he traveled behind enemy lines before he could eventually regain the Union lines. And when he did, he went back to the farmhouse well after the battle to retrieve his sword. And Carrie Sheads had kept a journal of her experiences during that time. And she wrote of that, "It was a sad sight to see them take that gray-headed veteran, but it was a joyful sight to see him return and reclaim his sword." So there's more to the story than that. if you're interested, you can just Google Carrie Sheads, or I've included the history of the New York 97th in the bibliography if you want to learn more about it. So if I do this slide, I'm going to run over my allotted 50 minutes. Is that okay? I'll just quickly touch on this. Julia Susan Wheelock played an important role during the Civil War, too. Her story begins in September of 1862 when she received word in her Michigan home that her brother, Orville, had been seriously wounded in the Battle of Chantilly. She packed her bags and went straight down to Alexandria, where Orville had been hospitalized, to help him, but unfortunately, by the time she got there, he had already died. Julia managed to connect with the nurse who attended Orville's death, heard the story, became very close friends with the nurse, and was moved enough by that whole experience to stay in Alexandria for the rest of the war, working for the Michigan Michigan Women's Relief Association to help wounded soldiers. And she wrote a book about her experiences called The Boys in White, The Experience of a Hospital Agent in and Around Washington. It sold pretty well, but went out of print eventually. Recently, she was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, and the book has been reprinted, actually, and you can buy it on Amazon. So since we're so close to the Blackstone River Valley, which is the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution, I thought it would be important to say something about the role that a couple local Wheelocks played in developing the technologies that powered the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to talk about Jerry Wheelock, whose great-great-great-grandson? Four-great-grandson is also Jerry Wheelock, is sitting in the audience today, so you can correct me if I make any mistakes. And I'm going to talk about Jerome Wheelock of Grafton. Jerry Wheelock established a dynasty of Wheelocks that owned and operated the Woolen mills in Uxbridge over the course of many generations. And Jerome Wheelock was instrumental in developing the steam engine technology. So this is a picture of the Stanley Woolen Mill, which is still standing in Uxbridge. This was the longest locally owned mill running in Uxbridge, operated continuously by the Wheelock and Taft families from 1833 to 1989. And this mill helped pioneer the manufacture of cashmeres, and it was one of the first to use power looms that were developed specifically for woolens. This was high technology at the time. This mill went on to manufacture uniforms for Union soldiers during the Civil War, and it continued to manufacture uniforms right on up through the First World War. And it's also the first mill in the United States to specialize exclusively in woolens. Now, Jerry Wheelock was born shortly after the Revolutionary War. He was the first member of the Wheelock family to become involved in the woolen business. He was a natural mechanic. He formed a company to create and manufacture the machines that were to be used in these mills. He was the inventor of numerous devices and inventions that made woolen manufacturing more economical and efficient. Many generations of his family after that continued in the business. In fact, the Stanley Woolen Mill here was named after his great-grandson, Stanley Wheelock. Did I get all that right? Yeah. Okay. And Jerry Wheelock tells me that a member of the family is still operating an offshoot of this business in Uxbridge?
Yes, he runs a yarn business.
Okay.
But they don't make the yarn anymore.
Right.
Right. My brother is still involved in pulling together wool from sheep growers and having woven into the crop.
Okay, that's amazing.
Can I just point out something in the
Sure.
picture there?
Yeah.
Just to the lower right is this sort of a little bridge, bridge-like thing. Well, that's
Right here?
oh no,
Over here.
right there. And
Yeah.
if you go down where it's dark,
Yeah.
that's actually the Blackstone Canal that
Right.
comes through there, and that's where the water wheel was. And I remember in 1954 when Carroll, I think it was Hurricane Carroll came through and that kind of spun it off its bearings.
I don't know.
But they still had steady jennies and belting that went up both for stories that ran off that wool, ran off that canal.
Okay, that's incredible. And I'd heard that this mill, this is an old picture, I'd heard that this mill was being repurposed for, I don't know, to maybe house stores and so on, but I'm not really sure about that. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Jerome Wheelock was another local Wheelock who played an important role in the Industrial Revolution. He lived in Grafton. He ran away at the early age of 15 and somehow managed to escape detection until he was old enough to legally live on his own. And you know, his parents must have thought this was a really disappointing start to life, but in fact, Jerome went on to do very well for himself. He specialized in steam engines, and in 1864, he invented and patented a device called the Wheelock steam cylinder packing. Don't really know what it is, but it was widely adopted by steam engine manufacturers all over the world. And it gave him the financial freedom to start his own company in Worcester, which he called the Wheelock Engine Company. And from there, he went on to continue to develop improvements and patent them. Many of his improvements and devices were displayed at steam engine exhibitions, which they held all over Europe and the United States. He won many awards. And again, these inventions were incorporated into steam engines that were built all over the world. And over time, he became a very rich man from all of these inventions. And one of the interesting things I note about Jerome, just from my research and reading probate records and so on, is that he was a man that was really concerned about his legacy, very interested in his legacy. He left a large sum of money to Grafton to build the library there and to build a statue of himself in the center of town, which is still there, and they still celebrate Jerome Wheelock's contributions to the town. He also left a sum of money to Worcester to erect statues of him across town. I don't know how many statues got erected, but one of them is in the, I think it's the bus station or train station in Worcester. I saw that about a year ago. I assume there are others around somewhere. And he has the largest headstone I've ever seen in the Worcester Rural Cemetery. It's stories high. It dwarfs every headstone around it, and it dwarfs many of the buildings around it. And this picture on the left is the sign that was in front of his company in Worcester, celebrating the Wheelock steam cylinder packing. So I'll close out with a mention of some famous Wheelocks, some of whom you've probably heard of. You may not have heard of Colonel Douglas Wheelock, who was an astronaut. He did 2 trips to the space station, one aboard Space Shuttle Discovery in 2007 for a short 2-week stay at the space station. and then again in 2010 aboard a Soyuz spacecraft for a long-term stay in the space station. And during that stay, the space station's cooling system gave out. Not a good state of affairs, and Wheelock was forced to do 3 unplanned spacewalks to fix that, which he did, and he received several international awards for that effort. Colonel Douglas Wheelock descends from the Menden line of Wheelocks who moved to Pennsylvania. Okay, Matt Damon is descended from Ralph and Rebecca Wheelock through her daughter, Record Wheelock, whom I mentioned earlier. And Emily Dickinson is also a descendant of Ralph and Rebecca through Record. Now, Emily and Matt are not that, you might think since they're both descended from Record, they're closely related, but they're not. They're distant cousins many times removed. John Hall Wheelock, who was a noted poet in the middle of the 1900s, and was also an editor at Charles Scribner and Sons. Has anybody ever heard of John Hall Wheelock? Okay. I count 2 professional baseball players with the surname Wheelock, both descended from Ralph. One played in the late 1800s, and then one played in the 70s and 80s and is still alive. And there are entrepreneurs, descended from Ralph. I already talked about 2, Jerry Wheelock and Jerome Wheelock. But if you ever go to China, you may, especially if you go to Shanghai, you may run across Wheelock Plaza with a tall building with the Wheelock logo on it. This is Wheelock and Company, which was founded in the 1800s by Thomas Reed Wheelock, who's a descendant of Ralph through the Nova Scotia branch. There are 2 architects, noted architects with the surname Wheelock. One was Merrill Wheelock, who designed the Masonic Temple in Boston. And another is Otis Leonard Wheelock, who designed many buildings that are still standing in Chicago. He lived in the early to mid 1800s. And just so you don't think that everything's hunky-dory with the Wheelock family, we have our fair share of thieves, murderers, and outlaws. In fact, there's one very famous outlaw that I wish I had time to talk about. His name was Oscar Merritt Wheelock. He was known in his time as the Dynamite Devil, and he has somebody should make a movie out of his story. But if you're interested, you can go to the Wheelock website and learn more about it. So that's the end of my formal presentation. If there are any questions?
Yeah, I mentioned in my house when I was a kid, my father had a Wheelock piano.
Oh, yeah. Yes. So there was a piano manufacturer in New York. I can't remember what his name was, but yeah, that was also a descendant of Ralph. Yeah. And there were there's a Wheelock China manufacturer who I haven't been able to connect with Ralph. So to me, that's still a mystery. Yeah.
In Central America, there's the Sandinistas, their minister was, propaganda was Jaime Wheelock.
Yes. Yeah, and he's descended
from the South.
He's descended from that Thomas Wheelock that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
How far away did your line move from this area?
Okay, so they started in Medfield. They went to Menden. From Menden, they went to Charlton. From Charlton to Western New York. And that's where both my mother and father were from, Western New York and Northern Pennsylvania. So I guess that's how far away they got. It's interesting, too, because both my mother's line and my father's ancestors were founders of Menden. Their names appear right next to each other on the Founders Monument in the center of Menden, so it's a small world. Yeah.
You've been at this for 20 years.
Yes.
How close are you to being finished?
Well, one thing I've learned is you're never finished. it's just not possible to be finished with a genealogical tree when you follow a single surname. So, you know, I had planned to publish this, and I would still like to do that. Part of what's keeping me back is I want to be finished, but I now realize that that's not possible. You just kind of have to focus and pick a subset and be finished with that. So that's probably what I'll do. Sorry? Yeah.
Volume 1.
Yeah, all right. To be continued by somebody else sometime later. Yeah.
Does Matt Damon know he's related to Wheelock?
I don't know. Dave, you tried to call Matt's brother.
I tried to call his brother. I couldn't reach him.
Yeah.
There were a lot of Damons in Arlington.
Yes.
And I was getting kind of discouraged at my lack of response from other Wheelocks, most of whom had their phones disconnected.
I think it's cell phones. Yeah. I think
But
this is
there
what
are,
happened.
yeah, probably true, but there's a lot of, I used to say 15 years ago, in 2016, we're going to look back and say, why did we put up with this terrible reception in 2001? And it still hasn't gotten much better. But anyway,
No, I think it's gotten worse, actually.
But I didn't know how, there's a lot of people named Damon, and I just couldn't motivate myself to start calling them.
Is it in Boston, anybody? Matt Damon?
Oh, yeah.
He's in Boston?
Yes, yeah.
His brother's an artist, either in Cambridge or Somerville.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're from Boston, too.
I've got a lot of Emily Dickinson, I don't know her.
Yeah.
And Matt Damon, I've seen him on different movies.
I think you see him at Red Sox games.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, yes.